Well, we're very thankful today to be joined by Dr. Bruce Hollis from the Medical University of South Carolina, Professor Emeritus, an esteemed researcher, clinician, very, very well published and cited in many facets of vitamin D. So, a perfect guest for our Vitamin D and Me podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Hollis, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I was directed research, primarily pregnancy, for my work that carried me through most of my career. Did a lot of collaboration on vitamin D cancer and epidemiologic studies with Harvard physicians and nurses health study up there that really continue on to this day. So, that resulted in a lot of publications of vitamin D in relation to a lot of other diseases outside of our work in pediatrics.
Wonderful. With that, because you covered so many areas, tell us a bit about some of the testing you developed, really a support of your experiments, but how that became so integral to the body of evidence out there today in vitamin D.
We determined vitamin D content in milk. It involved a lot of technical procedures, and ultimately we simplified these procedures, especially to measure 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is the compound that when you go to the physician and you draw your blood, it's the one they're going to measure. It's the one that gives you vitamin D status. If you go back into the 80s, it was never measured. Occasionally it would be done because it was always associated with bone disease. So, but it was rarely measured in a clinical setting. And as time went on through the 90s, and especially the beginning of the new millennia, the vitamin D testing exploded. And it became one of the biggest run medical tests in the world. And my partner and I, we developed really the first commercialized test that runs on these automated machines. We worked with a company called Diasorin Corporation, and we had an ongoing collaboration with them for almost 30 years.
Wow.
So I was working a job, consulting in industry for these guys, and I was doing my academic job. So it involved an incredible amount of traveling all around the world for 15 years. I'm done with all that. I don't do that anymore. But it was very rewarding to do this and to see those tests now progress to where they are now. So they're automated. They're on these automated platforms where you just load a blood sample into a cassette and press a button, and out comes a number. So it's progressed a lot from 40 years ago when we were doing the very basics at Guelph.
No, absolutely. From that perspective, in terms of getting the testing in place, what were some of sort of the initial findings once you had this tool that you and your team developed? What were some of the initial findings that really excited you in the sort of early years and the pioneering years of vitamin D research, where you felt that, hey, this is a trajectory for me, research-wise, clinician-wise, career-wise, that I want to use this as a building block going forward?
One of the things is in my graduate training, with respect to human milk, human milk was supposed to be the perfect food for the human neonate, except one thing: rickets. If that was their only source of food, and that really made no sense to me at all. How could that be possible? And so it hadn't been done. We wanted to define what content of human milk was, and it was much lower than it is in blood. And we eventually discovered that it was about 50 international units per day, not enough to really support the nursing unit, and sometimes a lot lower if you were a person of color. And one of the to regress a little bit, back in those days when you ran samples, the African Americans were always half or less of the circulating amount of vitamin D. And back in those days, they thought, well, I guess this is normal. Never thinking that it was detrimental to health, that it was okay for people of color to be half or less of the levels that were in white people, Caucasians, which also wasn't enough even for them. So, as time went on and we began to understand this more and even now, I think the underlying problem has to do with the terrible vitamin D status of people of color. So, in the testing, a lot of the stuff we were doing with Harvard was in retrospective studies looking at the relationship of vitamin D and cancer and multiple sclerosis and all these things from their physicians, their health professional studies that they have the blood bank up there with literally millions of blood samples, and then they decide what relationship we're going to. And I probably did 50 studies measuring compounds for those guys over the couple of decades.
Wow.
And resulted in a lot of publications. So those observational data, randomized controlled trials, in my view on randomized controlled trials and vitamin D is they're a waste of time. You can't do a randomized controlled trial on a natural substance when you have no control over what the initial levels are. Everybody starts with something.
There's always a background level, right?
Yeah, so it's not like a drug. I mean, you got it or you don't have it, With vitamin D, everybody's got something. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of these trials would go on where they would, everybody would get thrown into a group and again, without even measuring baseline levels and people give them some amount. There are so many other issues with running randomized controlled trials with vitamin D.
So when it comes to maternal transfer of vitamin D, I know you're well-known expert in the field. Is there a general guide, given people have varying background levels, but is there a general guide to the lactating mom, how much she needs to take for the maternal transfer, but also to ensure her own levels are in an optimal range?
Here's the funny thing about, something that we looked at. So in the blood, 25-hydroxyvitamin D is the form that's normally measured. It's the major circulating form, okay? Mm-hmm. That's not the form that passes into human milk. The form that's in human milk is vitamin D itself. So, so women can have quite high 25-hydroxy levels and have very little vitamin D in their milk. You go back, it gets technical, the half-life of compounds. Half-life of 25-hydroxyvitamin D is 2 to 3 weeks in the blood. Half-life of vitamin D is about a day, all right? Which means if you want to sustain levels, even in the circulation, you need to take it every day. In our studies, we need about 6,000 units a day to pass enough vitamin D into her milk to supply the nursing infant with, say, 600 IUs per day per liter of milk, and it did the job nicely. So to answer your question is, lactating women need to take 6,000 units, sometimes more, but that's no, my recommendation is that everybody takes that, not just pregnant women or lactating women, everybody take it. So I'm not singling that out, but in those particular situations, it's really key. And in pregnancy, our studies showed that vitamin D could actually decrease the rates of birth complications. I don't know if you know this, but when there's always this fighting about label claims on whatever vitamins by the FDA, what the FDA allows you to say. You can't put on a vitamin D supplement, this will cure cancer or this will prevent cancer. They won't allow it. You'll get squashed. You'll get a letter real fast.
That's right.
So a couple of years ago, the FDA saw enough validity in our work to actually put on the label that vitamin D can aid in the prevention of complications of birth. So wow. That's
a big breakthrough.
That was a big breakthrough that the FDA, because before that it was always bone. Will prevent, aid in skeletal, homeostasis, bone formation, which it always has been, and basically would not allow you to say one other thing about vitamin D, all these other things that were indirect. But a couple of years ago, they backed down and they said, we'll let you say that from this data that it will likely prevent complications of birth. Now, what they didn't say, they didn't give a recommendation of what you should take a day. And actually, that was quite a smart move, because what they basically said was, it's between you and your physician, and you should be monitored, which occasionally you should be. So take enough to get the level where you want it to be. And our level that we always targeted was about 40 to 60 nanograms per ml. And to get the population as a whole to that level, you need between 4,000 and 6,000 units a day in a normal person to keep those levels at, the 25 hydroxy levels at those desired levels. and also I say we're at loggerheads with the regulatory, not FDA, well, per se, but the official government recommendation is only 800 units a day for everybody. And that is, I think it's ridiculous and doesn't really do anything. And I've always asked the question, how is it that a newborn infant has a requirement of 400 units a day, and somebody who weighs 300 pounds has a requirement of 400 units a day? Nobody would answer that question. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And it doesn't make any sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you give an infant 400 units a day, a newborn, they're going to have really good blood levels. You give a 300 pound or 400 units a day, you'll see nothing.
Yes.
So it's always been a quandary to me. I don't really pay attention to the recommendations because they don't mean anything to me.
Well, and often the recommendations, both in the U.S. and in Canada, amongst other jurisdictions, are anywhere from 10 to 15 to sometimes even 20 years behind where the science is actually at. They're often very slow to catch.
Here's the problem. They want randomized controlled trials to make claims. It's never going to happen. Okay. Our randomized controlled trial in pregnancy and lactation each were about $3 to $4 million. Okay, funded by the government. They were only 1,000 patients. They want randomized controlled trials of 20,000. I mean, it's not happening. Nobody's going to fork over hundreds of millions of dollars to do this. And so my argument was, look at the data we have, make recommendations on that. Nobody, in all the studies that we've done for years, okay, and we have never seen one adverse event due to vitamin D supplementation, not one.
Within your studies, yeah.
Within our study and other studies. I've been on data and safety monitoring boards for other people's studies, and we've never seen, a adverse event on vitamin D intakes up to 10,000 units a day.
And that's a lot of study participants when you
stack
them up. Yeah.
Thousands of participants. And so it's like, well, yeah, there might be a problem, but we're waiting for the first problem to show up. It's dangerous, but we're still waiting for it. We want to see that one patient, and it hasn't shown itself yet. So I think it's ludicrous the way that they do this.
With all the publications you had, over 300, what are some of the real key ones in your mind that you say, yeah, out of all the ones I've been involved with, these are my top, 2 or 3 beyond the pregnancy lactation story? We touched on that a bit, but in other populations,
those are, you can go to Google Scholar and search out whoever you want, and they'll list the publications and they'll show you the number of times those publications have been cited. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And so number 1 on my list was a collaborative study that I was lucky enough to be in with Robert Modlin's group at UCLA on how vitamin D was a controller of innate immune function. It was published in Science. It's been cited almost going on 4,000 citations.
Wow.
So that was an incredible piece of science. It was showed that vitamin D truly is a master controller of our immune system. Both the innate immune system and the adaptive system. Adaptive system means generation of antibodies, and an innate immune system means it's a primitive immune system that animals without skeletons have. They don't have bone marrow, so they can't make antibodies. So an insect or a shark, or they only have the innate system where they have these toll receptors that attack bacteria and viruses. They can't make antibodies. And mammals have both systems. So, and vitamin D has a lot of control both in the innate and the adaptive system. So it has roles in autoimmune function and multiple sclerosis generation, but the one thing I would always say is don't cut your physician out of the loop. Tell him what you're doing. Monitor it, see how it's going, but it works. I mean, if you have low-level prostate cancer and you take vitamin D, largely it can keep it in check for a long time.
And drag it out at the very least.
Yeah, and I often told people, imagine if that was a drug developed by Pfizer, okay? And you had 70% regression in active surveillance. That'd be all over the news. It'd be a multi-billion-dollar drug. Yet for vitamin D, it's free, and it's unless you look at the YouTubes and stuff, you would never know that.
Yeah. No, very interesting insight on that for sure. What is your view on vitamin D as it relates to COVID and in the general population and specific populations?
So my point on vitamin D and COVID is, I don't think it will prevent you from getting COVID. I think it'll prevent you from getting it badly. Okay.
Okay. And
Okay.
why would that be? Or why, how does that, in basic terms, how does that work?
Well, vitamin D keeps your immune system in tune. So it keeps the innate immune system. So the initial response when a virus enters your body is the innate immune system goes after it, recognizes it. That portion of the system is vitamin D dependent, and then alteration of T helper cells by vitamin D to communicate with the B cells to make antibodies is also a key function of vitamin D. But one of the other things I think probably the biggest thing is the effect of vitamin D on cytokine storm and hyperimmune function. People, they get the virus and the virus didn't necessarily kill them. It was their own body reacting to it, way out of proportion. And I think vitamin D is really a key at stopping the body from doing that.
I see. Yeah. And explain a little bit about, because you hear in the media from time to time, not a whole ton recently, but when COVID first broke out, about the cytokine storm. What is a cytokine storm?
Well, you have anti-inflammatory compound proteins, anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory cytokines. Some turn on the immune system, some turn it down. All right. So vitamin D increases the levels of anti-inflammatory compounds and decreases the rate of pro-inflammatory compounds. So it keeps in balance. If you don't have vitamin D, those things aren't controlled as well. And once that happens, okay, you get into the cytokine storm. It can't be controlled. It can to some degree. That's why dexamethasone was so integral, okay, in having people survive it. Because what dexamethasone and prednisone would do is it basically would turn the immune system way down. And so, it actually saved people's lives when it was given later in disease when they were going through the cytokine storm. But nobody's going to take those things in a preventative fashion before you get sick. I mean, and I think that's why vitamin D again was key. Is it can keep your body from going, I'd say, just going crazy with immune function and getting sepsis, and then basically your body kills itself.
Yeah, never a good thing.
Yeah, not a good thing. No,
not a good thing. No.
And I've known people who've had COVID who had adequate vitamin D, but I don't know anybody who had adequate vitamin D that got really sick. People got it, but nobody got it so bad that they ended up in the hospital.
For those who were taking decent amounts or healthy amounts of D.
Yes.
Yeah.
That I knew. And so the guys on the other side, the anti-vaxxers and these guys, a healthy immune system will keep you from getting it. Won't. It's not. It's, vitamin D will not keep you from getting COVID. I know it. I know that's not true because I know guys who were taking a lot of vitamin D who still got COVID, but they just didn't get so sick.
Yeah, it's about severity and survivability, and intensity of and symptomology.
And that's what the vaccine does. You still may get COVID, but it's not going to kill you.
Right. Yeah.
You probably won't get it, but if you get it, you're not going to get it so severely. It'd be much less.
And what are your insights on how vaccines and D work together? Are they cousins, or are they not related, or do they serve the same purpose in different ways?
There's research to suggest that adequate vitamin D levels are required for adequate immune response,
independent of when one is vaccinated or not.
Yeah, I mean, so if you're vitamin D deficient, you're given a vaccine, your response to that vaccine might be blunted as compared if you had adequate vitamin D when you were given that vaccine. So there's evidence to suggest that the vitamin D will enhance the effect of the vaccine, but that's really not surprising since vitamin D has such integral control on the immune system in general. So it's probably important to be it's always important to be vitamin D sufficient no matter what it is, okay? But it's just another one to be vitamin D sufficient when you get the vaccines because you'll probably respond to it better. It'll be more effective at doing its job.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's the first time I've heard that sort of discussion and how the two relate to each other in this sort of way. So that's really interesting. What are some of the other ingredients that you feel are important in terms of an integrated approach to wellness alongside D? Or maybe you think there aren't any others, but
well, I know that there's one, okay, and that's magnesium. Okay. I take 400 milligrams of magnesium a day. I saw a study several years ago that highlighted to me, I was never much interested, in combination of nutrients, but this particular study was startling to me of how effective magnesium levels in human body are difficult. You can't draw a blood sample to really know if somebody has enough magnesium. Okay, you can with calcium, normal calcium. Magnesium is different. You can't do it. The only way you know if you're adequate in magnesium is if you're taking it. Okay.
So the RBC magnesium test, you're not a big fan of overall?
No, hey, look, it's easier just to take 400 milligrams a day, and you're good.
I got it. Okay.
In my own, I used to take 10,000 units of vitamin D, and I had a hard time keeping my vitamin D levels at 50 nanograms. I started taking magnesium, and I had to drop my vitamin D intake to 6,000 because it was going higher than I wanted. So it maximizes it interacts with the enzyme systems that have magnesium requirements for these enzymes to function properly.
Okay.
Some people vitamin K, and I don't have one feeling one way or the other about that. But magnesium really is an important one to take with it. And there's really no downside to taking it.
Interesting. And then when it comes back to vitamin D, and you talked about levels higher than you wanted in your blood once you introduce magnesium, for a balanced approach here, obviously, we're both big fans of vitamin D, generally speaking, and you've been such a huge contributor to the body of evidence over many, many years. What are some of the precautions? We talked about adverse events, so it kind of covered that. But when you talk about getting too high or taking too much, like with everything, there's optimal ranges typically. What are some of the things to watch out for if one is dosing at these higher levels, relatively higher levels of vitamin D that you'd flag?
So to me, if you look at, quote, the normal physiologic range of vitamin D, okay, what's the upper level that you can see in humans in any given physiologic state or environment? And that is the highest you can get a human in sun exposure, in sunny environments is about 100. Okay. So you can physiologically be at 100 in a normal state. So to me, that's within the physiologic range. So if somebody is 100, and we've seen it, I'm not worried about it.
And if the urinary calcium goes up, why is that a concern, though? You mentioned that.
Well, because because once blood calcium rises out of the normal range, bad things start happening. Okay. Neurological function that won't, urinary calcium, that's not the case, but that's the key to something. You could be getting into danger here with your blood calcium going to start going up because you're spilling it into your urine, and it can only take so much before it goes into your blood. You can get hypercalcemia by huge vitamin D intakes. I mean, that's well known, and that's the danger. Okay, that's what really has to be watched. But by the time you got hypercalcemia, you know, that's pretty late in the game problems. You know, you could head that off by looking at the calcium in your urine first before any damage happens. And then you can cut back. And the other thing when these guys would do, I'd say cut back on your dairy product intake, because you want to have a low calcium intake if you're taking these really large levels of vitamin D, because dairy products have a lot of calcium in them. So limit your calcium intake, and one of the ways to do that is limit dairy intake.
Got it. Explain again in your words, because I think this is really important, the difference between dietary intake of something such as vitamin D and circulating blood levels, breast milk levels, urine levels, because I think one of the limitations of nutritional and even medical science is oftentimes we use the same word to describe two completely different, often interdependent or independent concepts. And dietary intakes of, say, D or calcium versus D or calcium in the blood, just help us understand how they are unique to each other, how they are related, but they're not actually the same thing.
Well, the recommended, if you look at government regulation for vitamin D intake, they're grossly inadequate. I mean, 600, 800 units for an adult, it's not enough. Calcium intakes, I don't even know, is it a gram a day? I don't think normal people really need to have a calcium supplement. You know, I think if you eat a diet, normal diet, you're getting plenty of calcium. That's not the case for vitamin D, since vitamin D is not in the food supply. It doesn't occur in foodstuffs. North there, your First Nation people, they probably have if they're still living in the First Nation diet life, way up in the Northern Territories, they're getting plenty of vitamin D from their diet. So they get a lot, but a normal intake of a normal person, I mean, vitamin D doesn't exist in food. So it has to be gotten. It was meant to be gotten from sunlight exposure, but we really don't do much of that anymore.
Right.
You know, what I didn't say earlier is how much, we knew a long time ago that a single UV exposure, whole body exposure for 20 minutes would result in 10 to 20,000 units of vitamin D being made and released in your blood within 24 hours time. And yet, the regulatory agencies are telling you that an oral intake of 2,000 units could be harmful to your health. I mean, that was a recommendation back in 1997 that they came out with the upper level of intake at 2,000. I just, well, how the hell can that be true? When your body can make 20 or 20,000 units, but you're telling people that they can't orally take 2,000, or, they might get this, perceived something, hypercalcium that never was observed.
Right.
So, and the other thing I'll come back is when we wanted to do these pregnancy studies, okay, but we're going back here to 2000. And we knew, okay, that the requirements were way out of whack, okay, but we are up against something called the UL, the upper safe intake level, which was 2,000 units by the FDA set. And we knew that wasn't enough. We knew that if we gave women 2,000 units, it wasn't going to be enough to get them where we wanted them to be. So we submitted a grant to the NIH. It was a big grant, millions of dollars. And it came back, it got a perfect score, but they said, you're going to have to contact the FDA here, because we were wanting to give 4,000, it's double the UL. And so we petitioned the FDA, and you get what called a non-exempt IND or a full-blown IND. And we sent in and we said, well, we're pretty certain we're just going to fill out a couple of pages of paperwork here and they're going to let us do it. That wasn't what happened. They said, you got to do a full-blown investigational drug application like drug companies have to do for a drug, which took 6 months and a couple of telephone books of literature search and data submitted to the FDA to make sure, convince them that we weren't going to kill anybody. Okay. And of course, none of that ever happened. No adverse events were observed. But to get an investigational drug application to give a nutrient was unheard of. And we still operate under that IND today, as where others have actually used that as well. So, and when we first, 2009, when our pregnancy data was first coming out, and Basically, the pregnancy study was a safety study. Are we going to hurt anybody? Because remember, we had no idea that vitamin D back then could have any effect on birth outcomes. I mean, it wasn't one of the things on the field. But as we progressed through here, we became aware of it. And while it wasn't in the initial design, we had the data, okay, on premature birth and all the other things that go along, complications of birth. One other one went, so the paper that I referenced in Science about the toll receptors in vitamin D by the Moblin lab, it was published. There was one that was cited about 4,000 times now. So, a lot of the work had been done in rats, initial, immune function in rats because it's a convenient model. So there was this guy who had spent his whole career looking at control points of this toll receptor 2 and how it was controlled in rats. Okay. Well, rats are nocturnal. Okay. Humans had a response element for vitamin D in its control region. Rats didn't. Okay, so rats weren't that control point wasn't critical in rats for vitamin D because they didn't utilize it. It wasn't a control point in the in the production of that protein. In humans, it was. And it broke out I wasn't directly involved, but the nastiness of that review in the Science, because these guys were, the one guy were doing it in humans. He says, well, doing it in humans, you're doing it in rats, and they're clearly controlled differently.
Yes.
But he wouldn't, this was a National Academy of Science guy, the guy, and it was a vicious fight, ultimately got published, but this guy didn't want this work published.
Yeah, the Sprague Dolly rat is not human, that's for sure.
So here, that's the other thing. So scientists fight all the time, and
it obviously it often produces a good outcome and a better outcome for humanity. Often, not always, but it's friction that cool new stuff can emerge.
Here's the difference in science that came out of the North America and science that came out of Asia. Okay. In America, I could go to my mentor and question him, okay, and I could disagree with him. If you came out of Japan or China, you better not question your mentor because you would get squashed, and it squashed innovation in those countries because you couldn't question your mentor, and we are questioning our mentors over here all the time and fighting with them. So that's why America was a great place to have innovation, because they were much freer. The young people were much freer to express their ideas. You didn't have a hierarchy of somebody stepping on you, where you would disgrace them if you came to them and had something to disagree with what they thought. And it stifled innovation in those countries for decades. Now, I don't know if that's true anymore in China, but it certainly was true at that time.
Interesting.
Think of the innovation in the U.S. compared to other places. That wasn't by accident.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And you have to risk being offended to tear down your own belief system to learn new things and adapt it and
we're trained
reset your thinking. And
we are trained to question our peers and our superiors.
Oh, very interesting. Well, Dr. Hollis, this has been very insightful. As we wrap up here, one last one for you. Going forward, what do you see as for vitamin D as it relates to either immune function, COVID, or other health areas? What do you see as some of the key hot trends in vitamin D research or science?
Again, I'll come back, as everybody's always calling for randomized trials, and that's not going to happen. Okay. And in fact, industry doesn't want vitamin D to be a successful treatment for COVID. It cuts into their bottom line. They don't want vitamin D to be a treatment for anything, because they're all developing drugs for things that vitamin D can do for free. And so that's very frustrating. And I didn't like to believe this, but I think there's a lot of interaction between pharmaceuticals and in major science journals about suppressing data on things that they don't want out there, or things that they don't want to be effective. And I think vitamin D is one of those things.
Oh, very interesting. Well, with that, Dr. Hollis, I want to thank you kindly for your time today and all the insights and all the revelations relating to this area. Really appreciate it very much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.